joining us today to talk about implementing KYP, dealer and advisor case studies. That recording in progress gets me every time. A few quick housekeeping matters before we get started. We are recording today's session, as you could just hear, and we plan to share it with you following today's session. We welcome your engagement and questions throughout today's session. Please use the chat box that appears at the bottom of your screen and submit any questions throughout today's session. We've allotted extra time during today's session to take up any questions you may have. And if we don't have the answers, we'll do our best to get you answers and get back to you. Finally, as with many of you, we are working from our home offices, so you may hear some background noise, either babies crying or someone mowing their lawn. We appreciate your understanding, and let's kick things off. For today's conversation, we'll be focusing on practical approaches for firms and advisors to meet their pending KYP obligations. On the dealer's front, we'll zoom in on how best to assess and monitor their product shelf for significant change. And on the advisor front, we'll speak about meeting the KYP obligation and assessing a reasonable range of available alternatives, which has generated a ton of industry dialogue. And as always, we've allotted time at the end of today's session to address any of your questions throughout today's conversation. My name is Param Deseri. I'm the Vice President of Regulatory Strategy at InvestorCOM, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. And with me is Mr. Dave Carprice, Vice President of Product and Marketing. Dave, do you mind just quickly introducing yourself?
Sure, thanks, Param. So as you said, I'm Dave. I look forward to our conversation today. I look after product and marketing at InvestorCOM, and really the focus is on how to create solutions that provide compliance pain relief. And really over kind of the course of probably the last decade of my career, have focused on creating solutions in a space of principles-based regulations. So that's been CRM2, point of sale 3, and now with client-focused reforms. Really have enjoyed that kind of dance with regulation and practicality to say, how do we make solutions that work? And so looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Dave. So with only 3 months remaining, unbelievably, on the client-focused reforms journey, investment dealers and advisors will be taking the final steps, hopefully, to meet their specific CFR requirements. Throughout this sort of the zigzag journey, InvestorCOM, Dave, myself, the InvestorCOM family has really met with over 50 investment dealers from across the country and helped more than dozens of firms meet their KYP obligations. Let's start the dialogue by asking you, our audience, a quick poll question. So the question is, how would you characterize your level of implementation progress and preparedness of your firm? Are you making great progress? Do you have technology pain points? Are you all set? Or maybe you're not even started. I see one vote on the not started front. I'll give it 10 more seconds before showing you the results. Okay, let's go ahead and share those results quickly. And by and large, 61% folks are making great progress. 26% have technology pain points, and only 9% are all set. So with 4% who have yet to get started. So thank you all for letting us know about your progress. We've captured this piece of information in other settings as well, other webinars as well. So we'll do a quick comparison to see how the industry is making progress on this front, and we'll share it with you as well. Thank you all to the 70 folks who responded. So Dave, maybe this is a good touch point to kind of get into it with the fact that we're only 3 months away to the deadline. As you mentioned off the top, we have had the good fortune of speaking with a large contingency of the industry about how they're specifically meeting their KYP requirements. what are the 2 or 3 key highlights that come to mind as you've met and discussed this with the industry?
Yeah, I cannot believe we're within the 3-month stretch of client-focused reforms coming into force. It feels like just yesterday, late 2018, when we kind of released a vision for client-focused reforms, and I have just a keen memory of a luncheon we hosted, at a really quaint place downtown Toronto to just have a discussion with some of our clients about it. Like I said, it seems just yesterday. And similar to, as I mentioned, involvement we had done in other principles-based regulations, getting solutions crafted well in advance of the deadline really meant we got to have some interesting conversations. Part of that was about product, but it was just about as kind of frameworks are put in place, decisions are being made, we're thinking about how to apply that. And it also meant we've been able to participate in really meaningful conversations, both at the industry level and client specific. So when I think about this 3-month time horizon and the poll that we just took, like honestly, no surprises there in terms of the spread. Thank you for being honest. And also the stories or anecdotes that I provide today really are kind of free from any kind of assessment. It's really just, this is a reality, and sharing these stories I think are really important. And so when I think about 3 months out, what are the kinds of conversations, or how has that changed as we're approaching these last 3 months? I kind of create 5 buckets where I think of the conversations or how they've emerged or changed over that timeline you've got on the screen. There's the early adopters. So either these are firms that are visionaries, or they just had another need that happened to be it was opportunistic. There was a process, a gap, a shelf issue, something that was a good fit with where we were headed. And we've been working with them probably for over a year now. And so they kind of lead the pack, and we talk to them early and not so much now anymore. The second category I call the large firms. And these are firms that just, it takes over a year to do anything. And that's just, there's process, there are approval cycles, there's change management, there's integration requirements. So I'd say those conversations around KYP started late 2020. The challenge there was, they knew they only had a 12-month runway to get something ready by the end of the year, but they had to make decisions about something that they felt wasn't quite clear and nailed down yet. The third category I like to think of I kind of call them the planful firms. They just have an aversion of being pushed up against a deadline, and they have, fairly strict project and change management processes. These firms, they started forming their CFR teams March, April, somewhere in that time frame, and through spring and summer, they're thinking about the programs and assessing technology. And we're making decisions late summer. Like, I think we onboarded 4 firms like that over the course of the summer. So those are kind of the ones. They're planful, they're moving about, a fairly disciplined approach. Fourth category, I kind of call this the many of us bucket. I'd like to say most, except I'm not quite sure how many fall into the next bucket to know if this is the majority or not. But I think, like many of you on the line here today, after you woke up from the Canada Day fireworks and you've made it through the conflicts of interest work, then it was time to flip the page and think about KYP. And that there was a fairly large swell of conversations that we had there. And these firms were thinking through the summer about getting their project teams thinking through policies and processes and making decisions. And basically, if there was technology involved, kind of landed on those late summer into September, and are now in the process of finalizing that, thinking about rollout and training plans to get it all in before the end of the year. This group is probably in good shape to get things done kind of by the December 31st. And then I kind of have the rest of us bucket. And for various reasons, many firms started kicking off the KYP project after summer. And it's really interesting. And that's why I don't know how many are in this category, because since Labor Day, we probably get 2 to 3 inbound calls per week. And it's not uncommon to have our first conversation hearing things like, we are just brainstorming how to tackle this. And that principles-based nature of the KYP requirements is about that. It's saying, okay, we have to think about stuff. How do we want to define significance or materiality? And so thinking through that, they are doing that brainstorm part. And so, needless to say, the last two groups that I talked about, there's definitely an increased sense of urgency in those conversations.
So thanks for sharing that. And I really like the way you've kind of framed the different categories of preparedness here. And I think by looking at the 60-40 split in our poll results, I think you're bang on there, Dave. So speaking of the poll results, we know that firms are working towards the implementation deadline, and some will actually, as you mentioned, will be working past that deadline. What are you seeing in terms of firms that are working towards being compliant, but they've taken a phased approach on this front?
Yeah, so there's definitely that sense of urgency that's happening right now, and the work will absolutely spill over into next year. That's clear. When I look at the state of those conversations and the maturity, we're already in that window where here we are in October already to select, deploy technology and all the ancillary change management parts, training advisors and all that stuff, holidays, getting something in by the end of the year. We're already really, on the cusp there of things spilling over. And because firms haven't all made those decisions, it will flow in. And then the challenge is once you flip the calendar year, now you're trying to plan advisor education and training right in the middle of RSP season. So I fully expect really that rollout to just, despite best intentions, to roll into the post RSP deadline, after primarily for logistical reasons. There are a couple of other trends I think that have also impacted the timing for some firms. Around the time that the planful group that I called the plan, were kicking off their work. So that was kind of the midsummer. There was this theme that was making its rounds that the regulations weren't fully cooked yet. They weren't approved. There was still potential for change with some of the SRO guidance outstanding. And some were saying it's a fool's errand to go and choose technology to create a solution to spend anything until it's completely nailed down. And that talk track was with dealer firms as well as with vendors, right? To say, let's wait and then we'll go. And so and then we'll go part, if that only starts in fall, then here we are kind of really up against the deadline. That's likely not going, that's going to kind of come and go. So I think that's caused a bit of the push and bleed into next year. The other one I think is a really interesting one. And I think there's a financial component here, partly linked to I'll say that unknown or unfinalized nature, at least the perceived unfinalized nature of the regulation. 18 months ago, when firms were setting budgets, they weren't sure what they needed. And some were saying, oh, we can probably do this all with people in process. Do we need technology? I don't know. How much will that cost? I don't know. I remember last fall getting requests. We don't know what we need. Probably something like your solution. And if it were, give me a ballpark. So there's really vague questions that we provided, vague estimates just to put placeholders in budgets. But I think as the year went on, as planning started for real, I think there's some budget realities that came into mix and said, well, maybe this slides in so that we recognize the costs into our next fiscal year. For some, that's later this calendar year. For others, it's turning into 22. So that's kind of another theme. I think that's slid that out. And so the other thing I just wanted to highlight in terms of how do I see this time crunch playing itself out? A lot of emphasis that I'm hearing on phasing. So those firms that aren't, fully into the deployment and have all the steps mapped out yet, there will probably be some form of phasing. And some of the ways of doing that I've seen, one is let's strip it out of customization and integration, because those always take extra time, extra collaboration between internal IT departments and external vendors, and save customization and integration for 22. The other way of phasing our clients are considering is depending on, and I'll get to this a little bit later, of the complexity of the product shelf. Maybe let's start with the mutual funds and ETFs, which are fairly well structured and a well-worn path, whereas some of the other security types like equities, maybe fixed income products, push those into later. They represent potentially a smaller part of the business. There are more decisions around monitoring, about comparing, that may need to happen that haven't been made yet, and kind of let those slide to a phase 2. Not a later phase, like a year or two later. It's more just a month or two later in the deployment. So that's the second way of phasing. The other one that's come up is some firms have said there's a manual workaround here. We realize it's not sustainable. We want technology. We need technology, or else we're going to create this big burden on our IAs and advisors. But we can get through that year-end threshold with a manual process. Requires a bit more documentation, but it gives us time to implement technology on their terms. And then there's another group that actually is just saying, rather than doing something interim and then tweaking it, let's just go through our process. We know that deadline will come and pass. We're going to do our best effort to deploy as soon as possible. So they skip the interim process, but they know there'll probably be a bit of a delayed launch. Obviously, the firms talking to us, they all have this sense of urgency, and while they see that year-end threshold slipping past before it's launched, they still have that sense of urgency and commitment to making it happen.
Thanks, Dave. It's always you're always very thorough in compartmentalizing the different groups. And as you mentioned, things are getting real. And speaking of a sort of a compartment of the regulations that is getting more real than what was previously regulatory guidance, is the dealer's obligations to effectively monitor, assess, approve, and monitor the securities that they make available to their clients. Let's begin the sort of the more specific conversation around the dealer's obligations here, and the topic that everyone in the industry and news media has been talking about. There's been a lot of attention on the topic of closed or proprietary shelf versus an open or more large product shelf. What have you observed in your travels? Are there different practices across the board?
Yeah, well, the shrinking shelf sure has received a lot of media attention recently, and I'm going to steer clear of that conversation. Other than to say proprietary products exist, proprietary shelves exist, and they aren't going away anytime soon. I don't think that spells the end of the open shelf, however, and I think in the context of our conversation today, I think the emerging technology in the solutions for managing KYP requirements means that it's not the regulation that's driving shelf size down, it's a business decision. And I think in some of the media reports, there's support for that. Technology really means that monitoring, assessing, approving, whether it's a product shelf of 1,000, 10,000, or 80,000 products, that can probably be done without a proportional scaling of your workforce. So it's going to happen, or whatever happens, it's not necessarily because it's unmanageable. It's really for other reasons, in my opinion. Having said that, let me share a little bit about how some of the proprietary shops and even asset managers that we've been speaking with have been approaching KYP, and our solutions, and how they're viewing that. Thanks to one of our anchor clients who is a proprietary or has a proprietary shelf, we accelerated the development of our shelf analyzer solution, which is a feature of Shelf Monitor. And in our client, they included proprietary products on their shelf, and they were looking for ways to compare these to the universe of comparable products. As many of you will know, there's a special call out in that KYP monitoring requirement for proprietary products to make sure there's a due diligence around assessing versus the universe, not just relative to your own shelf, to kind of manage the I'll say the built-in conflict of interest that's in a proprietary product. And so our client wanted us to be able to do that really on an ongoing basis. So that they looked at this, the monitoring piece as partly competitive intelligence to understand what other asset managers were doing, but also for that assessment part of the regulation so that they could demonstrate that they're keeping an eye on that. An asset manager that we've been working with provided a really interesting insight. And while the CFRs don't directly apply to asset managers, they're the ones who are jockeying for space on these dealers' shelves. And if they're shrinking, it becomes a more difficult job to do. And hence, they do care deeply about the dealer and advisor experience. And when we walked through the regulation, some of the solutions, they noticed the level of discipline that's going to be required by firms and advisors. And they wanted access to a similar rubric to assess the relative competitiveness so they can keep pace. They're swimming with data already and have a good sense of their competition, but really a rubric that matches what an advisor might be going through to make that decision. The one quote here, I won't attribute it, but verbatim to this client, it was a comment said, "I didn't realize how binary a recommendation could be getting." And that was it really just meant to say that because of the consideration of alternatives, there are some factors that will either exclude or include certain products just by matter of course and process. If something looks like it doesn't have the investor's interests at heart, so a high cost product, for instance, maybe just doesn't enter the consideration set. And that was a bit of an eye opener for that asset manager. Certainly they're aware of cost sensitivity, but just how these tools might be used kind of with advisors was an eye opener. And the other thing, while not specifically a proprietary versus non-proprietary issue, what's becoming abundantly clear to me and to others in the industry is that data quality is paramount to the survival in a post-CFR world. These decisions are based on information about products, whether it's detailed research or a quick summary of where a product stands or stacks up relative to peers. We have pretty good industry data in Canada. We partner with many of them, so this is really not about kind of taking a shot there. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. But I think what's happened is in the past, when errors kind of crept through that ecosystem, found their way into back office solutions, most were oblivious to those errors. When they were noticed, they were corrected if somebody took the time to call it in and mention it. But because this data is now driving really important decision, and the monitoring piece means when bad data shows up and it looks like a big egregious change, people notice and it comes to light. Our shelf monitor solution notifies you when significant changes happen. A very quick story part, I'm gonna try to keep it short. So I did a demo one day and I pulled out one particular date, an asset manager had a product that had this huge drop in MER. And it was significant enough that I thought that can't be right. So I did a little mystery shopping experiment and called their customer service line and asked why their MER had dropped so significantly or if that was right. And they said, no, it hadn't changed. Now, several days later, I was watching and sure enough, a correction came through, in that case, through the fund data that found its way into our system. And quite frankly, all other systems that fund data feeds. And it was just that sample to say, because you can now see very quickly when significant and material changes are entered in error, everybody notices and it doesn't go unseen. So I think there's kind of an industry utility that's going to emerge here out of, I mean, Shelf Monitor will act like that, but other tools as well, to probably raise the bar on data quality because it plays a role right there in the decision-making process and the stakes are raised. And to that point, a client of ours that does have proprietary products, they went through the effort of validating pretty much every single data point in our solution because we allowed them to see what the data providers had about their products and they made sure everything was absolutely 100% correct. So not only are they properly reflected within our solution, but in every other solution that gets fed from those data sources. So they realize that value really quickly.
Hey, Dave, I think quite often the industry is very quick to say, hey, regulations have unintended consequences. But I think given your story right now about improving data quality across the industry by way of monitoring significant change, I think that there's a positive unintended consequence of this particular regulation. Speaking of which, have you seen much of a difference between how firms tackle their specific dealer KYP obligations, of whether they're on the IROC or MFDA channel?
Yeah, and so often kind of people think of that as shelf management or a gatekeeper function or due diligence. And I mean, for one thing, I'd say if you have a gatekeeper, you have to have a gate. And I say that a little tongue in cheek, but conversations we'd had 12, 14 months ago, a number of firms, if you asked about the size of your shelf, that concept, while not completely formed, wasn't really clear of what is on and what is not. And certainly not at a pre-sale level. So some had the universe available to advisors through their trading system and then caught anything that wasn't approved kind of in the trade review process. And so the one thing that's, I think, really evolved from just a year ago is the extent to which firms are thinking about this thing that has a gate. You're either on or you're off in a very tangible way. Now, there are differences across the channels I'm seeing. The one is, while not exclusively IROC, I'd say certainly the theme that arose more frequently with IROC members on our conversations is this universe idea, since the shelves by definition are just far more open than restrictive. Webinars we've done, plus many of the FAQ responses, really help clarify different approaches to shelf definition that are appropriate. However, there still needs to be a shelf and it needs to be defined. And it has to have this process to assess, monitor, and approve. So that really doesn't go away. We used to quote stats from a data analysis project we did 2.5 years ago about how much change happens every week. Now that we're using Shelf Monitor regularly, we just kind of take a look at it, and there's so much change, on the order of thousands of changes every day, and so that's how do these firms deal with that? And again, when I look at that, the differences between an IROC and an MFDA registered firm, a couple things stand out. One is, I'd say the MFDA firms typically really do have a clearer gatekeeping role to monitor approved securities for significant changes, which will trigger some actions like suitability assessments, portfolio rebalancing, and affecting product placement on the shelf. I think that tends to be a bit more well-defined and centralized. A bit of a theme on IROC firms is a bit less of an emphasis on that gatekeeper role and more on monitoring. And even on the monitoring part, the thing I've found is there's I'll say a desire or practice to delegate or move some of the monitoring function to the advisor. Because the amount of products available to the advisor are so significant, they tend to have their almost advisor-specific subset of a shelf that they intentionally want to monitor and stay on top of. So it's kind of evolving to a bit more of a decentralized approach. Again, that's not uniform across the board, but certainly that's a theme I pick up a bit more on the IROC side. And I'd also say that IROC firms who are dealing with a variety of security types are also segmenting this gatekeeper function. So mutual funds and ETFs might be dealt with in a particular way, equities and fixed income or other security types done completely differently. A bit more at the categorization approach rather than fund code by fund code. So I'm seeing that show up a lot more.
Thanks, Dave. For folks on our webinar today, as I said off the top, please feel free to use the chat function to submit any questions. We promised to take up your questions at the end of today's session. Having said that, let me, if we could just jump into another poll question. Given this topic of monitoring significant change, how does your your firm plan to monitor significant change across your shelf? Is it manual, using CDAR and external sources? Are you going to be looking at this in a phased approach and a phase 2 implementation project, or are you looking to use technology? We'll pretend there's Jeopardy music in the background and just wait 10 more seconds before we reveal the results. I'm getting a sneak peek. Kind of happy with the results. Give it 5 more seconds before we share the outcome. And I think we've got a good representation of the room here. So if we could kindly just end the poll and share the results. And as as a technology company, this is kind of music to our ears. Majority of folks, 71%, are going to be using technology. Having said that, there's about 13% who have a manual process, and 15% will be looking at this by way of a phase 2 implementation project. Great. I'll get this out of the way. Dave, speaking of product shelves, and now that you have your sleeves rolled up, can you talk a little bit about tackling the requirements around monitoring significant change? How big of an undertaking is that for firms who are now being becoming alert to this particular piece of the requirements?
Yeah, and we highlighted this in our implementation guide a few months back, where I think the biggest challenge, or at least the first challenge, is a firm has to define for themselves what a significant change is. The regulations kind of left that intentionally ambiguous. It's related to material change, however, it's not the same. And each firm kind of needs to think through what that is. And I mean, just a couple of points here, from conversations, we've seen a few different approaches. We've seen one, probably on one end of the spectrum, where for mutual funds, it's exclusively looking at risk rating and letting that drive significant changes. There are other changes that are interesting, maybe material, but significance in that case is something that's going to affect a portfolio in a material way. And that's, in their case, it's the risk rating that links to the KYC. Some others have kind of expanded that and gone to a handful of kind of key data attributes. I'd say the most common ones are some or all of fees, risk rating, time horizon, asset class, share class, product type, performance metric or metrics, and portfolio manager changes. I'd throw investment strategy, investment objective in there. Lots of conversation about that. Very, very difficult to monitor because that's just not a nicely standardized data point. If you look at either from a prospectus or a fund fact sheet, that's prose. So it's sentences talking about what that strategy is. So while we can monitor for a change, whether that's a significant change or not, very difficult to automate on that front. So most are not going too deep there, although they'd like to, if they could. That's mostly on the mutual fund side. For other security types, it does start getting a bit more challenging just because you don't have the standardization of some of these nice aggregate things like a risk rating, for instance. And so, common data points used for the measure of significance for common shares and ETFs would be things like price volatility, PE ratios, beta, earnings per share, dividend yield. But it's not as easy as saying this data point every time it changes, because some of these are calculated frequently. And materiality or significance only shows up over a certain time period. So then on top of choosing the data you want to watch, there's the definition of a threshold and a time period. So for example, if a trailing 12-month EPS is plus or minus or outside of 5%, then that's going to be significant. So it's a more complicated conversation. Important, but it kind of has to happen first to say, what are you monitoring and how do you define significance? And then you can kind of go to that the next level. really important best practice that I think have come up with some of the firms have thought really hard about this is you have to be selective and representative, or else watching every single data point becomes overwhelming. It's really about what are those key metrics that you say are significant. Many might be related, so pick one. That's a surrogate to really identify whether something's going on, something material or significant is going on in that product. Then once you've defined significance, the next step is to figure out how to monitor and with what frequency. As I mentioned earlier, with thousands of changes, every week, this is a really important decision. Some firms are relying on asset managers to contact them directly. So this would be primarily mutual fund dealers, whether it's MFD or IRA. They rely on the asset manager to tell them when material changes happen. And they have those relationships. So yeah, we can count on them. Others, just reflecting on the survey there, are reviewing the material change reports from CDAR. I don't know if we have anybody from CDAR on the call here, but these are both of those, especially the CDAR one, very manual and time consuming, if you're pulling those. And it's also information that's not well structured. So, we did I'll say an audit, I guess, for one of our clients of all the material change reports from one asset manager that happened in the first 6 months of the year to see, just to validate everything was coming through, all the material changes were coming through in Shelf Monitor. The good news is they were. The other insight was that a single press release or material change report often captures 10, 15, maybe more specific changes. And sometimes the way it's reported in a material change report is at the fund level. However, that's got to trickle down into every fund series, fund code that it applies to. And so the data-based approach that we take actually tracks all those changes at that funds or code level. So we don't create new data, but it takes that non-structured data and makes it structured and applies it everywhere that's appropriate. And so I think that the looking at the documents piece is a challenge. And so, yeah, as we saw there, many firms are using technology to do this. And so in terms of the frequency, we bring this data in every night and create our archive on a nightly basis. But the way clients are using that, I'd say range from those who receive alerts from us on a weekly basis to those who go in and do a monthly check-in on things. And usually it's not a pure brand new KYP requirement to monitor. There's usually some other internal process that you want to hitch onto, so you're not creating a brand new workflow in the middle of the month or in the middle of a cycle. And that could be maybe a monthly or quarterly shelf review process that's already there, so you collect information about material or significant changes to products on your shelf, or suitability reviews. You may have a schedule for that, making sure you have the right information at that time. So there's some other components that often dictate the frequency for the clients that we've seen that have already integrated the monitoring with the rest of the program.
Got it. Hey, Dave, thank you. You've, I think, captured the majority of questions that people have had, because we're not getting any questions. Folks, please use your chat box, ask any questions that may come up. Let's actually give Dave a quick opportunity to catch his breath. Let's jump into the advisor-specific element and dig down there. I think just by way of regulatory preamble, we've heard directly from the regulators, and they're fully expecting advisors to meet their KYP obligations and assess a reasonable range of alternatives when making recommendations. They also expect advisors to document this type of analysis that they're doing. So let's use that as a quick segue to ask you our final poll question. How important will digitizing the advisor's record keeping be when complying with the KYP and enhanced suitability requirements? Very important, somewhat important, not important. I think we'll see what the results are in a short few seconds. Let's give it 5 more seconds before we reveal the results. Perfect. And you guessed it. I'm sure you'll see the results momentarily. And over 80% or 80% have said that digitizing this practice or record-keeping practice will be very important. Some have said somewhat important. Others, a low percentage of 3% have also said not important. So some manual work still going on in our industry, although fairly little. Okay, with that poll out of the way, Dave, hopefully you've had a chance to catch your breath, drink a glass of water. I've got a couple more questions for you, and really focusing in on the advisor's obligations. But taking a quick step back, the dealer's KYP obligations really have a trickle-down impact on the securities that are available for advisors to recommend. Given this open versus closed or proprietary versus non-proprietary shelf discussion that we had at the top, can you talk a little bit about the differences, approaches you've seen and you've observed in the marketplace?
Yeah, especially in the advisor space, that conversation around recommending proprietary products can be a really delicate conversation sometimes. I think the advisor's obligation is clearly within the approved shelf. So you can start putting blinders on this experience to really manage that. So sometimes it simplifies their work in the case of something like a proprietary shelf, where shelf construction is just done in such a way that some of these requirements are less daunting. And so there's certainly a simplification or potential for some simplification there. It doesn't relieve that requirement though. A proprietary shelf still requires a review of alternatives and that proficiency requirement of the financial professional, the advisor, as does an open shelf. The key is that the consideration of alternatives is done consistently and aligned with your business model. I'd say that the most interesting conversations are when a product shelf has both third-party and proprietary in there. And there the emphasis really is on how to continuously or to continue to do an objective comparison. And from a business perspective, look for ways to ensure a proprietary product is considered in that assessment. So it's not tipping the scales, it's really about business practice. And so our peer compare solution really takes that objectivity to say you define peer groups based on criteria, things like the SIFC code and risk ratings. And that's a way for the firm to ensure there's a consistent approach I'm taking across my shelf, even if it's mostly or all proprietary products. There's still a consideration of alternatives, because even in a proprietary shop, not every choice will be the best or suitable. And I think regulators have made that clear. And some firms are looking at ways of, I'll say, positioning or, positioning a product within a sample set, identifying it as a preferred or a whitelisted indicator. Again, that doesn't relieve the need to do the comparison. And the key is that the advisor still has to go through that comparison. So before recommending a proprietary product, she is still looking at all comparable products on her shelf. And if those are third parties, if she continues on to make a recommendation for a proprietary one, the context is the record shows that she's viewed how it stacks up to all available alternatives on her shelf. And so you kind of match the proprietary nature with kind of the objective nature of that peer comparison exercise.
Hey, Dave, thank you. I think we've talked a lot about kind of what we've observed in the marketplace. To keep our promise to our audience, it's at the 1:45 mark, so maybe we can allot the last 15 minutes to address any questions that are trickling in our chat box here. And let me kick things off, and I think I see some questions coming in. Folks, please use this time to ask Dave or I any questions that may come up. Now, let's begin. I see one question around sort of what are some best practices for monitoring significant change and letting advisors know about how those changes are going to be impacting the end portfolios or end investors' holdings? Any comments on that front, Dave? Yeah,
I mean, I'd say there's a couple of practices. I'm not sure any of them are as best practices yet, but a couple that I've seen. One is a centralized approach, as I mentioned earlier, where kind of the monitoring across the shelf happens, at the dealer, at the firm level. And then on one end of the spectrum is at the dealer or at the firm level, suitability is being checked on portfolios, and then communications to advisors are happening when exceptions occur. So I think of that as the full serve dealer model. There's an in-between model, which one might be, the dealer receives the report of significant changes, scrubs it, cleans it, makes it a bit more advisor focused, and then makes that available, say, through an intranet or through a portal. The third way is where I've seen some firms go is to, as I mentioned, moving that directly to the advisor. The challenge there is the overhead, because we all know communications with advisors have to be relevant, really streamlined and efficient. And something like, if you push that monitoring obligation to the advisor, you want to make sure you're only giving them information about the products they care about or that are held in their book, and a really narrow set of data points. So there's some administrative overhead that comes with creating a solution that an advisor is doing. But I'd say there are firms really in all three of those camps.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. One more question. This is more on the advisors front. One of the main points that has come up is around kind of the frequency of performing that KYP analysis or requirement of reasonable range of alternatives. Can you touch on the different approaches you've seen across the industry?
Yeah, and I'd say really again three buckets there. First is purely through training and education. There's some challenges with respect to that approach, in my opinion, around frequency, recency, and specificity. How do you make sure that the product I'm recommending today was caught in the training I did last month? How often do I do that training to make sure it's still relevant? I think annual doesn't seem like the right frequency, but that's kind of the reasonable thing when you think of how often do you do training for advisors. So anyways, that's one approach. The second one we've heard of is kind of actually I'll go to the other end, which is really on every recommendation, you do a quick comparison. How does this product stack up to its peers? That's our terminology there. But and that way, you're always using the latest data. The advisor has seen that context based on today's data. So if a product risk rating has changed, it's now in a different group of comparable products that have a similar risk rating. The challenge in that one is it happens frequently, so it really has to be frictionless and as automatic as possible to make that step fairly slick. There is a middle approach there, which kind of takes the detailed product review, but doesn't make it directly connected to a recommendation. And so you require process and policy to follow on that to say, if you're recommending products, and I'll just say this, for example, if you're recommending a product, you will have had to review it or it versus its peers within the last month, within the last quarter, pick your time frame. But there's kind of it needs an extra bit of a wrapper on that to make sure you can enforce it. And again, the record keeping part there is really important then to make sure that it's done recently enough. And there's always a risk of a material change kind of happening in that window from when you first looked at it to when you recommended the product.
Thanks, Dave. Speaking of documentation and record keeping, we've got another really intelligent question here, and it's around how much detail are firms intending to record as part of their record keeping process? Do you have any insight on that front?
Yeah, so we use the term guardrails, which is a bit of an ambiguous term, but basically it kind of depends. So I'd say that the best practice that I've seen is when you've got an idea of saying, these are the products that go through fairly easily, no additional justification required. Okay, you need to define that. What does that mean? Does that mean relative to its peers, it's in the bottom half on cost or risk or performance or something? Like you define those guardrails and say, provided you've looked at it and you've seen that it measures up appropriately, good to awesome, there's no additional documentation required other than the fact that you've done this exercise. Then there are kind of you start moving along that continuum. If you're choosing products that, may have a flag, and again, process and policy wraps around this to say, if you're recommending the, a cost that's in the, a top percentile versus its peers, tell us why, because it doesn't appear that it's in the client's best interest. There are all kinds of mitigating circumstances, so it's really document them and then continue on. And we're able to usually do check boxes versus verbatim, because that's a way to implement policy as well. To say these are the 5-10 reasons that are appropriate for moving forward with the fund.
Good point. One more question. You're sort of you've got the hot hand here, Dave. So I'll throw one more question your way. I don't know if we've got the specific answer here, but I know you've dealt with in the past and have some insight on the shelf reduction piece. What are you seeing in terms of numbers when that product shelf is being reduced? How are folks going about it? Are there any insights you have on that front?
Yeah, don't have a specific answer there. Although I'd say firms that are like, this is ongoing, right? Managing and optimizing shelves. It's a theme that's come up in a lot of our conversations. Some firms have said, we've just gone through a shelf cleanup, so this is good timing, or others that said, we might be sending you frequent shelf updates because we are going through this process. In terms of what is causing a product to be included or excluded on the shelf, we haven't, that's not an area we go into with our client conversations very frequently. I'd say certainly, I mean, you kind of get the fund series that are available, which that's kind of a group exclusion or inclusion. But, I'd say that there is the historical path is I work with a particular asset manager and all those products are included, or we don't work with a particular asset manager, so all those are excluded. I'd say we're moving into a bit more of a nuanced space where it's not always carte blanche. If I'm working with this asset manager, we include all their products. If they're applicable fund series. So I think it's going to be a bit more nuanced moving forward.
Great, thanks, Dave. Couple more quick questions, and folks, feel free to ask more questions as we've got 7 more minutes, roughly speaking, for today's webinar. Let's take a look. So there's another question around how are firms, I mean, it might be worthwhile for you to reiterate this around how are significant changes being communicated to advisors or flagged for advisors. Do you want to just take another stab at that?
Yeah, I mean, again, just on one, it's, one approach is centrally, you view what's material. Head office or like at the dealer level, you're probably looking at a broader set, and then you offer key insights to advisors, or it's more around portfolio specific. You care about this change because this portfolio is now crept offside. You have an action to do. So it's kind of trigger based. If it's direct to an advisor, then it's a bit more of providing a streamlined set of information and just giving them kind of the raw data, not interpreted, but streamlined. If that makes sense. Yeah,
good point. Good point. One quick question actually just came in on how would you explain this comparison or assessment of a reasonable range of alternatives? I think maybe touch on the framework that we've developed to tackle that piece.
Yeah, and I think widely in the industry, there's really 2 ways of doing it. One is, I call it the head-to-head comparison. It's my iPhone shopping experience, right? I choose the models, and then I get a long list of features and benefits. And when you take that approach, you spend time asking, how many products have to be in the consideration set? It's highly subjective because I'm the one choosing the products that are in that list. The second one is a bit more programmatic, where the advisors are choosing. They're not constructing the peers are determined. And so in that case, our solution is that latter, where we do a definition of the peer group, and then all matching products that have those characteristics. So, asset class, load type, risk rating, all products that match that are in the group. And I mean, I'd say in the model we've worked at, we get a reasonable size for most peer groups. They're 10 to 50, let's say. And then it's an aggregate setting to say, you know, there's the high, midpoint, and low, and where do you stack up? So as opposed to saying it's this one and this one, it's saying of all the alternatives, here's the relative ranking. So we know relative to its peers, it stands up well or not.
Dave, maybe I'll add one more piece here. Sort of you've added the two frameworks or two approaches. One is kind of this how one product stacks up against the iPhone approach, as you mentioned, or using our peer compare approach. The third approach that's sort of adopted, and it's more of a manual self-attestation front, is to say, I'm making a recommendation. Yes, I've considered alternatives. The challenge with that third approach is that it doesn't provide enough evidence in a way. What were the alternatives? How did you assess product A versus B versus C? Just saying you did something doesn't necessarily provide substantial evidence for that taking place. And then how was that, analysis in the client's best interest, which is kind of part and parcel of the purpose of the regulations to begin with.
Yeah, good addition. I don't hear that much because firms that are saying we're just going to attest having done it usually aren't looking for a solution to help them document.
Right.
Yeah.
Folks, I don't see very many other questions, so maybe we'll give you a solid 3 minutes back on your calendar today. Let me just say that as we've discussed today, the client-focused reforms are principle-based in nature. They're tackled differently across the industry and require a significant amount of professional judgment. As you march towards this December deadline or a phase 2 approach, we welcome the opportunity to speak with you and find opportunities where we can help you meet your KYP requirements with confidence. Please either download our implementation guide that is on screen or book a demo and reach out to Richard Pitcher, our very own client director in Canada. Thank you very much for your time today and have yourselves a great afternoon.
Great, thank you.